are divided against each other. The people who run the country are very good at this. They've managed to turn men against women. They've managed to turn white-collar workers against blue-collar workers. But mainly, for 400 years, they've managed to turn white people against black people.
Violence is a part of America's culture. It is as American as cherry pie.
You can't win. It can't work well. What can you accomplish? There's nothing you can do. The United States government is so powerful. What you do doesn't make any difference. You don't matter. And I think the revolutionary lesson is just the opposite. What people do makes all the difference. What people do or don't do determines the outcome of things.
Well, United States government is not invincible. It doesn't exist for all time, and it's not going to exist for all time. It's fully resistant.
We have gone on the offensive, and we call the shots now.
We no longer wish to be treated as statistics. We want to be treated as human beings. It's Machine Kill.
Hello, friends and enemies. It's episode 186 of This Machine Kills. I'm Jathan, joined by Jeremy. Unfortunately, Ed couldn't make it because the universe would not allow him to be at this recording. So just a quick recap. Ed was speaking at Netroots Nation in Pittsburgh and was meant to fly in last night. But because he hit a bunch of blackjacks at the casino, the karmic balances had to go had to weigh out. And so his flight was delayed overnight until the next day, and then has since been delayed a couple hours every time it's meant to start boarding. So Ed does not live in New York anymore. Ed lives in Pittsburgh, and he is finding a job at either a defunct steel factory or a Heinz plant. He will be Thomas Friedman's heiress wife's personal assistant. So that's what's up with Ed. Maybe, eventually he'll be back on the podcast, but I know he's very sad to miss this episode, which we have had planned and could not move because our guest was very, very kind to speak with us late at night in London. We are happy to be joined by Dan McQuillan, who is a lecturer in creative and social computing at Goldsmiths in London, and also the author of a really, really great book called Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence, which I will say, in all disclosure, I was approached by the publisher, Bristol University Press, to provide an endorsement blurb for the book, and I was happy to do so. And as I said, with analytical and moral clarity, McQuillan makes the case for recognizing the radical politics of AI and meeting its goose step march head on. So, Dan, thank you for joining us. Very excited to get into your book.
It's really great to be here.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's a good book, and I also do appreciate that it's following this lineage of books recently. A lot of them coming out of presses like Verso, but academic presses, I'm happy to see are getting on it, of just like books that are more like really extended essays. Like they have one big argument, one big thought to give, and they do so in a really punchy and succinct way. They get to the point, and your book does that really well. It doesn't spend a lot of time beating around the bush or padding out the word count. So it's actually one that people who don't have to read these tomes for their job can pick up, read in a weekend, and understand and move on.
I'm really happy to hear that. I mean, that was the intention. I mean, I hang out in academia because I do believe that some of that depth critique is really necessary, because if we start from a lot of assumptions, pre-cooked assumptions, it's very hard to find a way out of the maze. So I do like, the ideas that are generated within academia, but I get very frustrated that they stay there. They're only really accessible to a sort of mutualized elite. So my interest at the end of the day is in changing things. So yeah, I'm really happy to hear that the book is at least able to be out there, because that's what it's that's the intention.
We'll kind of walk through the book, and one thing it does do is it like the first couple chapters are a really excellent primer for as you put it, the operations of AI, right? Like, how does this stuff actually work? But importantly, critically understanding it for the purpose of understanding what kind of work it's doing in the world as well. And it's right there in the title, resisting AI, right? You're there's no kind of false neutrality here. But importantly, I want to start with that, like not only why or how do we resist AI, which we'll get into, but what kind of resistance to what kind of AI? Because we just released on the Patreon an episode where we dig into and take aim at effective altruism and long-termism, right? Which is now kind of becoming the court philosophy, the court ideology of the elite, and especially the technological and self-proclaimed enlightened elite. And a lot of that shift from the effective altruism, the kind of just, I think a simple-minded but very extremist version of utilitarianism, kind of Peter Singer style stuff. That shift from there to long-termism, as we talked about, is really influenced by people like Nick Bostrom and the idea of existential risk. And with that, there's meteors and there's climate change and all that, but for them, the real existential risk is the intelligence explosion, the singularity, the runaway AI that's going to, turn every atom in the universe into a paperclip if we don't invest a lot of money into creating good AI controlled by good enlightened people. And in the book, you start off right from the beginning saying that, these kinds of super intelligent AI apocalypses are not actually the answer to the what resistance, what AI, what harms. So could you let's start there.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I do think those things are an incredible diversion, and actually, extremely motivated as I do expound on a bit in the book, motivated by an unconscious allegiance, perhaps sometimes to some very old ideas about superiority of intelligences that runs across our whole history of colonialism. So really, that stuff is very toxic in its own right from its very roots. My interest was not engaging in any of that or in any of the sci-fi debates, because my political understandings would be that actually a lot of the political harm that is happening right now is in the intensification and amplification of systems that are already there, that are already imposed on the people with the least capacity to fight back most of the time, in the bureaucracies, in as you would say, the housing projects, in the areas of where minorities live in our cities, wherever it is. There are already many systems which are quite excruciating in their latent cruelty, and adding the capacity of AI to these systems really amps up a lot of the tendencies which are already present, both sort of technical, institutional, and to some extent psychological, that allow these things to happen in the first place, and to my mind make them even more weaponized and more dangerous. And that's that kind of, if you like, has its origins, I suppose, in my commitment to a sort of 1970s community politics, really. That this is the area of primary concern. This is because this is the actual front line of society. And I see AI having a real effect there right now, nothing to do with, some projections of a sci-fi future.
That idea of a kind of acceleration and amplification of already existing things. I mean, that I think is, it's definitely a theme and a kind of analytical approach that runs through my work as well. And I think it's really powerful antidote to not only the discourses by the kind of, the boosters and advocates in Silicon Valley, or the kind of, people like the Bostroms and the William McCaskills, or even Elon Musk, who, are want to be doomsayers about a very specific kind of thing, but even critics, right? Like this is what Lee Vinsel calls the critic hype, where it gets really easy to pay a lot of attention to the really fantastical stuff at the sake of the mundane, and not mundane because it doesn't matter, but mundane because it's things that already exist. It's normal, right? Like we don't need to pay attention to that, but I think that you spend a fair amount of time in the book, I think rightfully arguing that these are where the real kind of political, like the real politics, but also the real material consequences and computational operations of AI are happening. So let's get into that a little bit. Like, how is AI a political technology? What kind of politics is it, and what kind of technology is it?
Sure. Well, I mean, just to kind of finish off on the point you were making, I suppose one of my starting points would be that the kind of worries you're talking about, and also the kind of more everyday statements about AI, which I find almost equally irritating, which are the ones where, which I'm sure you're over familiar with, where a critique of AI will start off by saying, well, AI, of course, has many things to offer to healthcare, stroke, insurance, stroke driving, whatever it is, but, here's the few problems I've identified. I mean, these are both, all of these critiques really are based on an assumed platform of sort of normality and stability and liberal order. The assumption that that's what we're living in, and that what we should be concerned about are perturbations of those things. And if you have a perspective that, as I do, that actually the world we're living in right now is extremely disordered and dangerous and damaging to far too many people, then you would start from a different perspective. But I also start from a perspective of somebody who works, in computer science. I mean, in the computing department, which of course is an advantage to some extent, And one of my other concerns, let's put it more positively, one of the other things I was trying to address was I was reading a lot of early critiques of machine learning and AI by, people who I really like and respect, who are social scientists, or even journalists, and they're getting a lot of things right, and I was I think hitting a lot of things on the head, but sometimes veering completely off the mark simply because there wasn't basically any real familiarity, let's say, with how this stuff actually operates at a granular level. What does it really do inside? My interest, my method, I suppose, is to try to read across the levels at the same, simultaneously. I mean, the sort of, whether you think of it as a kind of a sort of stack or a set of resonances or whatever, my interest and my understanding of the sort of historical, material, political effects of things is when there's some kind of synergy or some kind of resonance between sort of the affordances of a tool and the political or social situation it's occurring in. So it's a very long-winded way of saying what I'm looking for. I look at AI and say, well, what's this thing actually doing inside? What is machine learning actually doing? What are the operations of, minimizing a loss function? What is backpropagation actually doing? Okay. And then trying to read upwards from that, if you like, in saying, what is that likely to not deterministically amplify, but under the circumstances where we're looking at the particular distribution of power and decision making that's already exists in society, what would this way of doing things exaggerate? So, my understanding of AI at a very basic level is pretty simplistic. I mean, it's extremely complicated. It's mathematically sophisticated. It's computationally intensive. But essentially, it's a statistical approximation, of a function. It's taking a lot of input data. It's taking some, exemplary output, and it's asking a computer to match a function. And that's great, and it's all very clever. And I actually quite like technology. I'm a bit nerdy, so that's all very interesting. But looking at how that works, on the nuts and bolts of it, would for me means looking also at the resonances and the consequences, the likely knock-on effects of putting that into operation in the world. It's one thing studying it as a form of computer science, but this stuff doesn't stay in the box. It connects outwards and has unintended, perhaps, like knock-on effects in the real world. So if we're talking about ranking and ordering things in abstract mathematical concepts, but they're also very real subjective social experiences that can have very real material consequences. So, or decision boundaries. A decision boundary: are you in or are you out? Are you one of us or are you one of them? I mean, these are, a decision boundary can be a very abstract mathematical concept, but the same kind of thing applied in the real world and carrying, whatever authority it does carry. That's one of the things about these kind of methods. What kind of authority do they carry? What authority is as ways of knowing and ways of doing? Then those things will gain a life of their own. And so that's my interest in the detail of AI, is looking, okay, what is it really doing as a material technology? What's it doing on a data level? What's it doing on an algorithmic level? And what is that likely to act as a resonance chamber for when it gets into the world?
I'm snapping and I'm clapping. I love that, because I think that approach really resonates as well. I've been thinking about it in my own work in terms of the kind of two archetypes, and the first one is the mechanic, right? Like really being that mechanic, getting under the hood, understanding like how are the, how does this connect to that? How do these different components kind of fit together? How do they work independently? How do they work as a system, right? Like really, I think it's important to understand all of that stuff to kind of have that, what the sociologist of knowledge, Harry Collins and his crew down at Cardiff have called interactional expertise, right? Like really being able to talk the talk with people who work on this stuff day to day, because you understand how it works. Even if like I myself could not go in there and, build the car, I at least understand how the car operates, and I can talk to people who do build cars and have real conversations with them and hear, the car is AI or machine learning, or I'm currently looking at a PDF on my desktop right now from the new edition of a generalized linear models for insurance rating textbook put out by the Casualty Actuarial Society of America, and saying, well, as part of my, InsurTech project, this is what I need to do. I need to read the textbook on how they do and better understand generalized linear models, which is, how actuaries do underwriting and risk assessment and stuff like that. And so, it's a lot of hard work, but I think you're absolutely right that it's totally necessary to really have to take seriously that material analysis of these systems. It's also why, as a inveterate, Marxist political economist, I also read balance sheets and, quarterly reports for companies that I'm studying and things like that. It's like at once you have to be CFO and CTO, and while also being the chief critic of all of it. It's a lot, but I think it shows in the work, right? Like it shows in the quality of the work, the understanding, and the analysis that flows from it. And I think it also, and I'm kind of preempting where we're going to go later in the episode, but I think it is also fundamentally a feature of that kind of other archetype that TMK listeners all know well, is the Luddite, right? Like, the original Luddites were the people working with the machines and the technologies. Their critique, both, the political and the material critique, the one that came at the end of a hammer, came about from an understanding of how the technology worked, working with the technology, and therefore understanding how the technology was working against them for somebody else's interest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think at the very least, you and I are trying to take the lid off these things so we can call them out where necessary. Not allowing that's a fairly basic sort of political tactic, is to be in a position where you can debunk the claim, the hubristic claim to expertise that people will try to deploy to override, well-founded critiques you might have of the effect that something's having on somebody's life. So you can open the box and say, well, actually, I know exactly how this works, and to be honest, it's not that impressive at all, and in fact, it's quite distorting, it's quite reductive, it's quite simplifying, and you're using it really very much within a set of interests, within a very specific set of interests. I mean, I had a head start on this because when I discovered, after a long journey through working with largely non-profits and NGOs around technology and so forth, that some of my original training, which was I did my PhD in experimental particle physics, and I discovered that some of the maths in machine learning was actually very similar to the stuff that I worked on all those years ago, and I could immediately, not tooting my own horn as they say, but I could kind of see through it straight away, and that combined with my my other experiences of the actual politics of inequality, and the two things came together very quickly. And I think maybe that's where you're going with the Luddite. That is a technopolitics that's non-dual. We've ended up in a situation where these kind of understandings are highly separated, and sort of insulated from each other. You have people who understand technology, and then you have people who understand the political effects in communities and on people's individual lives. Those two things are partitioned. So, the Luddites' actual technopolitics came from an embodied understanding of the inseparability of those things.
One of the things that you talked about in terms of like how AI is being used, you mentioned it here and you talk about it in the book, is as this kind of technology of difference in a lot of ways, right? It's about kind of creating, ever increasing segmentation, drawing correlations in order to create difference. And it made me think of something I'm starting to crystallize with my insurance work. And I want to, obviously insurance as we understand it is also based on a lot of difference, right? And a lot of technologies in insurance are, when they're bringing in different rating factors, whether it's, demographics or genetics or behavior based, these sources of data for rating, different techniques for rating, whether it's the generalized linear models that have been around since like the 50s or now increasingly moving towards kind of AI or machine learning. A lot of that is about multiplying difference and then making that an actionable insight in the world. And it's interesting as well to see like that's not a fundamental necessary feature of insurance, nor is it a fundamental necessary feature of AI. In reality, right? Like insurance, I would argue, can be premised on answering one of two questions, right? It's either what brings us together or what sets us apart. And that first one is the real actual origins of insurance as a social institution based on cooperative solidarity. But then it only became premised on that second one, the what sets us apart, when it became a capitalist industry based on competitive segmentation. And I think you get to something very similar happening with AI, and you do so through this kind of anti-fascist approach to AI. Could you just talk to us about what is an anti-fascist approach to AI? What's the kind of the usefulness here, analytically, morally, politically, whatever, for kind of connecting a kind of understanding of fascism with an analysis of AI?
Wow. Okay. Yeah. There's probably a few pointers put in there, but I mean, following on from your just to start with, because I think it is a key point. This idea of difference. It's not so much the idea of difference that is problematic. I would say it's the way that these technologies, and actually the actuarial ones, are kind of really just along the same spectrum as machine learning and AI, the way they deal with difference, and this connects with the question about fascistic approaches. I would say the problem with the difference is the way that those differences get frozen. They become essentialized, and that idea of essentialized difference is really a starting point for this sort of simplistic and usually inevitably ethnocentric understandings, narratives, and solutions that are proposed by by varying forms. And we see varying forms at the moment, from sort of religious fascisms or purely political fascisms or eco-fascism. These are all, in the end, reductionist and simplistic divisions of us and them, based on some supposed and yet vital innate difference, which in itself not only justifies but sort of mandates in intensified forms of violence to exclude and eliminate those others. So difference itself is, the most interesting thing about the world and life. And there are other ways. I suppose an anti-fascist approach to try to answer your question in that way would be about having a different approach to difference. And in that sense, the sort of mutuality and mutual aid that you're talking about as being the origin, like here would be the origin of the National Health Service. The National Health Service didn't spring, newly formed from the head of some politician in 1945. It was based on exactly that same kind of, community worker mutual insurance to fund community hospitals and healthcare and so on and so forth. But the kind of mutuality that is anti-fascist is one that is whose stance is an embrace of difference and a working with difference rather than an elimination of difference. So that's why I kind of like to also lean on some of the ideas of people like Karen Barad, who talks about a kind of new materialistic approach to understanding the world through difference, because the approach that her and similar thinkers have towards difference is kind of diffractive. So my simplistic understanding of that would be that it's about using difference as generative. And my concern about political projects that head in the direction of fascism or fascisizing things, or however you want to put it, are those who want to essentialize difference as a starting point towards elimination. And again, the capture process you talked about, where mutuality was somehow sort of captured and inverted into to the other part of your dualism, who is unlike us, what is the other, is again, that's absolutely coherent with fascist political understandings, but sort of moving a couple of steps prior to that, it's also foundational to capitalist or particularly neoliberal status quo. The idea I've found through going through the process of writing the book and trying to understand how to figure the problems which AI accentuates, let's say, I would come back to terms like enclosure. That what we're talking about there is that there's a resonance between the decision boundaries of AI and broader concepts of enclosure. And just to finish off this rambling response, the problem, the reason why I focus on having an anti-fascist approach to AI is very much because fascism is already here. We can see that it's returning in a sort of macro or sort of molar political form, as Deleuze and Guattari would say, and it's really there in its overt manifestation. Nobody needs, I think, probably any introduction to the idea that there are real fascistic political movements in or close to state power in very many places, and more active movements. That's the latter symptom of the problem. The fascistic political tendencies are latent within our so-called normal liberal order, I would suggest, whether that's at the level of the sort of bureaucratic, technocratic way of structuring society, and also in the ways we're encouraged to behave towards each other, to believe about each other. This is what Deleuze and Guattari call microfascisms, the sort of latent authoritarian and violent impulses which are encouraged and produced as subjectivities in this society. All these things are already at play, and they aren't constrained unless there's a conscious anti-fascism in whatever it is that we're undertaking. That's why I'm trying to make it clear that a commitment to anti-fascism is important in this area as it is in every other.
I like that you have a quote in this from Fred Hampton about fascism. Nothing's more important than stopping fascism because fascism will stop us all. It's a true quote. I don't know who said this quote. Fascism is just basically capitalism in decay. It's like what happens is that capitalism starts to fall apart. fascism takes over, who runs that capitalist machine right now more than anybody are tech companies. The rush to use quote unquote artificial intelligence, win some type of, I don't know, like space race to their end goal, is going to end up with a lot of people underneath those treads to get to that point. And correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't like Timnit Guru, weren't they fired from Google for pointing out the tendencies of the AI towards racist and other problematic themes of like pointing an individual or pointing people out or not being able to determine people based on those certain things? And then you know, that's something that people are going to get left behind because they're not fitting a specific thing that AI is programmed, quote unquote, AI is programmed to look at.
Absolutely. And I think Timnit's firing, my understanding of it is, and I stand to be corrected, but interestingly, I think, and relevantly, not only the engagement with that as a broader narrative, but the daring to point that out within the institution. You know, on in a way, what might seem like a more mundane level of saying, look at the simple everyday inequities, you know, of race and gender that operate within our supposedly futuristic, enlightened entity, this organization that we're supposed to believe in, like some kind of religion, you know, for the temerity of pointing that out. And I think that's the kind of another symptom of this kind of the pathologies that run through our institutions, is that if and of course, you know, the Panthers were, you know, a far more brutalized and vivid example of this. You know, if you do dare to actually challenge, you know, the really existing latent fascisms in society, then, you know, you're going to draw perhaps not unexpected response. And I think the you know, the idea of these AI futures, you know, really are, that's again coming back to the beginning of our conversation, why these are such a dangerous diversion, because, you know, we're not talking about the dangers of some sci-fi fantasy. We're talking about some really mundane, embedded and gritty everyday problems, which are, if we can perhaps understand AI not as a technology which is seeming to sort of emerge as the fruition of people's already existing movie-fed dreams about a possible transcendent future, but a technology that has itself emerged in a time of collapse. You know, AI has emerged post the financial crash. AI is emerged into a world where climate crisis is, you know, accelerating and iterating on itself. You know, I think if we have a materialist understanding of technologies, if we understand technology as something that, you know, reflects its times, then, you know, we're not looking at AI, you know, emerging fully formed from the head of Zeus and then interacting with the world. We have to say, well, AI can be read in this way. It is itself already a response to the veering collapse of the, whatever you want to call it, I'd maybe call it the neoliberal order. It's a collapsed technology, and it's there to manage, you know, to try and manage that collapse and maintain the hegemony as much as it can.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, to the point about Timnit Gebru, while Timnit has absolutely and continues to be, you know, vocal in pointing out and criticizing the kind of racist, sexist, and other reactionary tendencies in Silicon Valley, what they're firing more directly from Google was linked to was a paper that they co-authored about the environmental cost of these large language models, you know, the kind of future of Google's business and the kind of industry. And so, if anything, what they did was point out something even more dangerous to capitalism. You know, the sexism, racism, all that, those are social limits to capitalist growth. But the environmental costs, the resource intensivity, those are material limits to capitalist growth. You know, the capitalism can handle the social limits, but the material limits are the real kind of limiters here that capitalism must ignore and overcome, or just or try to blow through. You know, that I think is very interesting. That was the last straw, right? Like, you know, we can be we can give the mouth service of, we care about algorithmic fairness, or we care about, rooting out bias, or wagging our finger at discrimination and these kinds of things. But, when you start talking about stuff that stands in the way materially of us advancing these technologies, that's a straw too far. And I think it gets to that point as well, Jeremy, that you were talking about, and I also had the same kind of quote in mind that fascism is capitalism in decay, or the way I was thinking of it is that fascism is a crisis response from capitalism, right? Like it's the old internet joke that if you post a pet doing something cute or funny online, someone's invariably going to come in the mentions and say, actually, they only do that when they're distressed. So this is not really funny. And that's capitalism, right? When it starts sliding into fascism, that's when the political economists come in and say, actually, this is not just weird and funny. Capitalism only does this when it's in distress. And so, that, and you mentioned this in the book as well, that, this is part of that, as you talk about fascism, and you're drawing from the work of the political theorist Roger Griffin, who describes it, very densely but succinctly as palingenetic ultranationalism, right? Or in other words, this kind of, palingenetic being a kind of national rebirth, and the ultranationalism, as you describe it, indicates that we're not talking about a nation defined by citizenship, but by organic membership of an ethnic community. And so it really is that idea, and you rightfully point out that historically fascism has never come about through these kinds of revolutions, but by the decision, as you write, of the existing elites that they need it as a prop for a collapsing hegemony. And so that, to me, is really a powerful insight for understanding the development of AI, because as you point out, I mean, AI is talked about by everybody as that kind of as the savior technology, whether it's going to get us to Mars, it's going to push us through the limits of growth, it's going to do this or do that. Everything is always about this is what's going to save us from the collapse. This is what's going to save us from crisis, but also it's what's going to preserve and further perpetuate the ruling status of the existing elite in society.
Absolutely, and it makes me recalls for me, again, circling back to our conversation about the benefits, if you like, of trying to spend time with, as you said, what can be sometimes quite tedious or complicated internal operations of whatever particular apparatus that we're looking at, whether it's insurtech or AI or something else. I won't mention blockchain. The benefits of these things are to bear in mind that larger sort of geopolitical context at the same time as looking at, almost at the minutiae of the technology. When I was looking at AI and trying to understand why there was such a fuss about it, why it was kind of accelerating and undergoing its own sort of inflationary universe period about 10 years ago, just to try and understand the actual internal operations and how they might be applied to fairly mundane everyday problems and issues and questions and functions, was when I started to interpret what was going on with the operations of AI as running alongside or even enacting what I was reading at the time with a theorist called Agamben, the idea of the state of exception. So what started off in a very perhaps superficial way in social media, let's say, where there is a kind of interesting dynamic with AI that reflects the nature of the fascistic threat in our society, and that it's not going to come, goose-stepping neatly, down the main street in a historically recognizable way. Actually, it's far more fluid, and as we know, meme laden in the present moment. It's coexistence and sort of transmitted through the same technological mechanisms of communication interaction that everything else is. So it's got a fluidity, and yet it also retains that same essentializing, binarizing, us and them finality. That's its kind of endpoint. So what I'm trying to get to here is the idea of a sort of fluidity of these decision boundaries. One of the advantages that AI offers as a mode of ordering is its non-linearity. Its ability to respond to quite complex data sets, and that's its whole purpose. It exists to create a functional relationship between things that are beyond simple analytical relation. You can't, create a simple equation to relate this input data, this output data. Everybody tried to do that with facial recognition for many, many years, and it never worked. And it did feel like that was something that only human intuition could do until along came convolutional neural networks. They do manage to create that functional relationship. They do manage to draw decision boundaries in ways that are sort of fluid, flexible, and effective in their own way. And what I'm trying to get to here is that's great, actually, if you want to evade regulation of some kind, if you want to evade oversight and order. What is going to work better for you than a technology that is innately opaque, right? Which the stuff is. It's not just a black box. It's innately opaque because there is literally no way that anybody is going to look at the internal workings of a large deep learning network and be able to unpick it exactly what it's doing. And as we all know, and I'm sure has been covered many times on the podcast, the people who do this themselves will go, well, I don't really know how it works. I know that it does work. I mean, I have some operating understanding of the ways it does work, and perhaps sometimes of some of its failure modes. But I don't really know what goes on inside. So you've got an incredibly opaque technology, which is really good for avoiding any kind of democratic oversight or whatever. But you've also got one that manages to, evade regulation in a way that creates what I was talking about at that time is continuous partial states of exception. So it's not the full state of exception. The full state of exception is the refugee camps that, the EU is so keen on instantiating at its borders and in other countries where people literally have every right stripped away. They literally are bare life, which is another of Agamben's terms. It's not that yet for most of us. But what it is, much smaller, what seem perhaps somewhat tangential states of exception. It could be as simple as, being excluded from using Airbnb because associationally your data profile triggers some warning feature in their trait analyzer. Or it could be something slightly more serious, like which is a real example, where a database, a machine learning algorithm tied to a database decides that you would be an opioid risk if you were given these kind of painkillers, and so you're not allowed to have them. And what's more, the pharmacist isn't allowed to challenge that decision either, because they are also being continually ranked, monitored, and assessed by the same system. So, these things are states of exception in the sense that they remove a right that you might previously have assumed to have had as part of a sort of general citizenship or general, a member of a particular polity. And that effect has, I think, very rapidly, in the last 10 years, moved out from, perhaps getting booted unceremoniously off Facebook to having the material conditions of your life substantially, and I suspect you're finding the same kind of things in the sort of insurtech stuff that you're looking at, and I know that you guys have covered it in terms of fintech, and it's coming at us from all angles. And historically, if you look at the real way, as just to loop back to the point that you made, if we look at how real fascistic situations arise, they don't arise from some, storming of the barricades by fascism. They come from some capture of power, and then this kind of salami slicing away of rights for particular groups of people in particular places, more and more and more and more, until, we sort of it's the boiling frog thing, and then we sort of wake up and realize, no, actually this really is fascism again. And here we are. And I see some coherence between the operations of AI and that kind of political dynamic, hence writing the book, hence advocating an anti-fascist approach. And yeah, there we are.
Yeah, lots there to dig into. I'll start with the boiling frog thing because it reminds me, I'm currently reading a teaser for listeners. Next month, we're having Cory Doctorow and Rebecca Giblin on. Cory back on, Rebecca on for the first time, talk about their new book called Choke Point Capitalism. And I'm reading the book right now. It comes out next month. But in there, they talk about the boiling frog metaphor that, in reality, if the water gets too warm, the frog just jumps out. So what you need is somebody to put a lid on the pot so the frog can't jump out, right? And so that's what, they describe. That's what the kind of choke points that capitalist industries put up in markets to prevent people from exiting, once the prices get too high or whatever. But we see other kind of systems like that as well, where it's like at some point you just got to put a lid on the pot because the water might get too warm and people might get, hey, this isn't comfortable anymore. Something's happening here. But by that time, it's too late. They've already put a lid on the pot. And it, now makes me think as well about our sister podcast Trash Future is very fond of saying, all this can be summed up as computer says no. Whether it's you are applying for welfare benefits, for example, or you're applying for a job, or you're applying for insurance, at any point where you have to apply for something and then somebody or a decision has to be made and it comes down to whether the computer says yes or the computer says no. And it's the Weberian, iron cage of bureaucracy, but now it's the data cage of computation is what it's turned into. It's even more inhuman, even more levels of remove from a seemingly human decision point and therefore a human authority and human legitimacy that can be questioned or appealed in some way. And it makes me think as well about what you were talking about with, a fundamental feature of that AI and fascism both have in common is this kind of essentialization of difference, not just the identification of difference and the increasingly technical forms of observing and managing and creating that difference. Thank you, IBM, for providing the punch cards for to help facilitate the vast administrative informational burden of the Holocaust. But also around that same exact time, or a couple decades earlier, actually, the insurance industry was really pioneering the indexification of knowledge through literal index cards held in large steel filing cabinets with battalions of computers, i.e. women, who would be creating these kind of hyper detailed profiles of people on index cards filed in big cabinets, as the historian Dan Boak calls it in his really great book, How Our Days Became Numbered. Right, these were the first database, and it's the insurance companies that were creating these kinds of first information architectures and databases, but a lot of this is, again, it's this trajectory, it's this history, this continuation of this kind of essentialization of difference once it's created. And then the question becomes like, how is that treated, right? And how do people in various positions in various ways kind of contribute to that essentialization, both the creation and the recognition and continuation of it as a thing? We have like really extreme examples of someone we've talked extensively about in some earlier episodes of the podcast, Palmer Luckey, right? The kind of founder of Oculus, now that, go on to found Anduril Technologies, a sister company of Palantir, very similarly and explicitly about, as he puts it, right, innovating for the kill chain, really kind of creating and providing these American-made technologies for the Pentagon, for the customs and immigration, the Border Patrol. And in 2018, right, I just remember a quote that we found for those episodes that we did with Michael Richardson way back in the early days of the podcast, where Palmer Luckey was at the Web Summit in Lisbon, one of these big conferences, and on stage he says, technological supremacy is a prerequisite for moral supremacy. That's like comically, explicitly fascist in all the ways that you're talking about. But it's also like yes, Palmer Lucky's a cartoon supervillain in like every single way. Well, like a cartoon supervillain from the Venture Brothers, as we talked about exactly. And Jeremy just put in the chat, I'm going to fight that Venture Bros villain one day. But there's like so many other people in various ways who contribute to that same kind of belief and that same kind of essentialization without even knowing that they're doing it, or without being so explicit about their adherence to, we talk about the political economy. I want to shift us towards talking about the political epistemology of data science. It's the people, the data scientists who have this belief in the power and authority of this epistemology, without being, so explicitly fascistic about it, but still being in that kind of like contributing to a system that is fundamentally, currently fundamentally fascistic in a lot of ways. Or it's the frontline bureaucrat who just says, computer says no. So it's like we just have to listen and we can't question it. This is all a complex way of getting us to something I want to start talking about now, which is that in 2018, it's a brilliant paper. I love it a lot. And I get something new from it when I go back. This was my first introduction to your work. But you have this paper from in the journal Philosophy and Technology called Data Science as Machinic Neoplatonism. I want to get into, I think in order to understand the political economy and political theory of AI, we also need to understand the kind of political epistemology that is at the core of data science as this kind of profession, as this way of knowing and acting in the world, and as a particularly powerful and influential way of knowing and acting in the world. So I'll leave it there and let you, maybe what made you want to start analyzing data science in this way, and then we can get into some of your analysis and arguments about the kind of machinic Neoplatonism at the core of data science.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I'll kind of segue into it by just picking up on a couple of the trailer things that you finished off with, which was just, for example, as you say about the cartoon venture capitalist supervillain aspect. I guess we all expect that, whatever social grouping we're involved in, there will always be one or two, pathological people around. That's just the way it is. And it's obviously deeply unfortunate that those people gain incredible power, which is the indictment of the system. But what really interests me is why everyone else goes along with it. Why do all the people who work in those companies go along with it? Why did all the people, as you say, had to administer that vast administrative apparatus of incredible evil effect? Why did they go along with it? And that was why, the Hannah Arendt's concept of thoughtlessness was useful to me, because it talked to and how algorithmic additions to institutional structures can accentuate the ability of people to distance themselves from the consequences of what they're doing. I mean, if you do go to one of these refugee detention camps on an island or a detention center here in the UK, wherever it is, if you are simply a human being, you cannot be unaffected by the actual cruelty and violence of what's going on. But people are insulated from it. They do manage to distance themselves from it, and they do manage to carry on with administering these apparatuses. And I think it's important to look at that. It's important to look at that, but it's also important to look at the roles that algorithms play in it. And this does circle back, I think, I had to look back at that paper myself. I thought I knew I would have to, and I haven't read it in a long time. And actually, I was pretty happy with the fact that it had stood the test of time. I mean, I think that the thrust of the points I was trying to make there, I used them myself when I was writing the book, which is, much more explicitly trying to tackle, the sort of ultra political and sort of global crisis aspects of AI. I did go back to those same concepts, and I guess it was influenced, again, to circle back to something I mentioned at the beginning, it was influenced by my own background in science. That is my education. I was brought up with a very scientific worldview, and I'm still committed to the idea of science. In some way, I'm committed to the idea of the empirical investigation of our world and our reality, and the value of scientific methodology in some sense. But actually, I found a line of flight away from science because there were already many things about it that, as science, I found problematic in their likely social consequences in terms of the authority claimed in relation to the solutions provided, as you might say, or even the sort of visions of neutrality and objectivity and incredible insight as compared to the actual everyday practice that I observed. So, I was already primed with some questionings about the scientific viewpoint, and the scientific viewpoint is one that data science, it's the clues in the name, right? Data science. It explicitly names its own allegiance to scientific perspective. It mobilizes scientism. So it's not really some data science isn't science. It's not based on repeatable experiments and a large body of mutually reinforcing and testable theories or falsifiable theories. It's not based on any of that stuff. It's a bunch of statistical correlations that have a useful operational effect in a much more sort of immediate business or other sort of investigative way. It's not science. But it has a scientific aspect. It draws authority from those things, and the things it draws authority from, those epistemologies. So I'm finally getting to your point, right? Those epistemologies, those ways of understanding the world, those ideas that there is, the point for me about Neoplatonism is the conviction that there is a deeper order to be found in the world. That's a very scientific. In fact, Neoplatonism was one of the precursors of science, right? So the idea that there's a deeper order, the idea that order is inaccessible to ordinary everyday experience, and is only revealed by specialist and elite practices of some kind. So this would be getting towards either the scientist or the Neoplatonist philosopher, or in our case, the data scientist. That this greater symmetry, this purity. And again, there we might say, well, there's a hint of its problematic politics even in that term. But there's this purity of insight into the world that is to be derived. Is something that I found, in the much more sort of mundane papers on data science that I was reading at the time. That there was this unquestioned allegiance to this philosophy, mainly unconsciously and mainly through no fault of the practitioners, because it's actually it is the dominant knowledge philosophy in our society. It's the dominant knowledge philosophy that actually underpins all the other activities of society, in terms of law or business or everything else. So it's not surprise, it's not data science's fault, but data science is explicitly picking that up and running with it in the process, partly because of being so unconscious about what heritage it was kind of picking up on there, managing to cause a lot of collateral damage in the process. So I don't know if that's making it at all clearer, but for me it was an already existing critique of this idea, that there was a mathematical vision of the world that was superior to people's lived experience and should be raised above it, and that actually had an epistemological superiority to the voice of experience. And I find that has a lot of negative consequences.
Absolutely. There's a lot there in terms of as well. I mean, because I'm now like so insurance pilled that I see everything in relation to all of the work I'm doing on insurance, and also I have a particular interest in actuarial science, which I think very much mimics your own kind of interest and investigation into data science, because I think that there are a lot of really direct core like analogies and comparisons that we can draw between these two kind of professions that hold so much power in the world, in very similar ways, and really the only differences between them are cultural, not not epistemological, not economic, not political, not whatever. It's just cultural differences, right? Of kind of features of their time. When we think of data scientists, we think of the hoodie wearing, staying up all night, call it the flow zone of coding, and that kind of the tech bro kind of guy, right? That's what we think of when we think about the data scientist. When we think about the actuaries, right, we think of a very stuffy and somber and sober, kind of suit wearing, monotone, all of that stuff. But those are features of the times that those industries were, or those professions were created, because like data science, actuary science holds the distinction of being a profession created by and for the industry it serves. Actuarial science was created by and for the insurance industry. Data science was created by and for the technology companies, and specifically the kind of Silicon Valley model of computational technology, digital technology companies. Whereas, data science is an outcome of the California ideology. Actuarial sciences was created literally in Victorian England, right? It was a product of the guild system. Theodore Porter, in his great book, Trust in Numbers, has a section where he talks about the gentleman actuary. Right, where a lot of the moral authority of the actuary didn't not come from necessarily his, and it was always a he, superior techniques and data sets, but a lot of it was distinguished from their superior moral fiber and character, right? They were the type of person who would be able to expound authoritatively on subjects such as, morality tables and insurance premiums and that kind of stuff. But ultimately, there's the same kind of epistemology at hand, and I think it's why we can see a kind of handshake happening between something like machine learning and actuarial science, where and this is a kind of an insight drawing from your paper here, but in both of these, more direct forms of knowledge, such as your answer on an insurance questionnaire, might be treated as actually less truthful than a proxy inference about you based on other sources. I'm writing a paper about all this right now, and so I at the top of my head, I have a quote from the president of U.S. Life and Health at Swiss Re, the world's largest reinsurer, who is giving an interview and a video for the credit rating agency AM Best. So I'm deep in the industry, talking to industry, producing media for only industry. But in this interview, the executive at Swiss Re said, quote, "We've got a number of predictive models going. One specific example would be we've got something called a smoker propensity model. It can predict whether you smoke or do not smoke without actually asking you the question or testing you for it." So in other words, people lie all the time. And so insurers, like credit scoring agencies, like technology companies, like advertisers, are much safer trusting indirect data about customers or consumers than direct information from consumers, right? In other words, it perfectly aligns with your observation in your paper that, quote, "Events in data science are constituted not from experiences, but from those traces of experience which can be datafied," end quote. And so, this is you talking about and drawing from the work of people like Donna Haraway and kind of situated knowledges that, that this kind of direct apprehension of information and experience is devalued because it centers an inferior subjective viewpoint rather than a superior objective God's eye view, so but in lieu of God, right, the machine will do, right? And that seems to be, you have a really nice turn of phrase here in the paper where it's, with data science, we have moved from metadata to metaphysics. It is an embedded, even weaponized philosophy. So, maybe could you expound on that a bit more, right? It's not just that we have, really, by scientific standards, actually quite low standards of truth in data science and actuarial science, because all they want is statistical correlations, not causal, relationships. But but there's something really powerful that comes from not caring about truth in that way.
Yeah, and asserting a superior form of truth, which is not, it's not only problematic because it so obviously aligns with, sort of stakeholder interests around various forms of exploitation. I think it's, I have the same sense that you do, that this is appealing to, much not more primal, but a more deeply embedded understanding of what's right and wrong. I mean, I think it's interesting that quite a few times in our conversation today, the concept of morality and the moral judgment has come up, and it's something that I do, I do slip in a few times into the book, simply because I did feel that what algorithms were making a lot of the time, and this is very clear in the ongoing transformations of the welfare systems, which are happening right now through machine learning and AI, are actually mobilizing forms of moral judgment. And it is again interesting, for both of these fields, like you say, data science and actuarial science, that so much of this seems to have its origins in sort of Victorian thinking. I sort of, you were just making me think, because I do reference obviously the work of Victorian scientists like Galton and Pearson in terms of their mathematical development of regression, but also their commitment to eugenics. And you made me think that actuarial science, or rather eugenics, is a kind of actuarial science of the population in some sense. So I think what unlocked it for me really was feminism, actually. Was coming across the work of people like Miranda Fricker and her concept of epistemic injustice. Really, that made the bridge to me from my unease about this assertion of a superior and abstracted mathematical knowledge, a level of insight that was somehow superseded people's own account of their own lives and experience, and what it really meant in terms of material, not material, subjective, interpersonal, psychological, psychic experience of relationality, or destruction of relationality. That really was the Rosetta Stone for me in being able to link this unease with not only with its actual consequences, but with what to do about it. I mean, that's really it's good to have these kind of frameworks of analysis to be able to understand why actuarial science, data science, or AI itself, these are all problematic, why they all not only echo, but are like a sort of amplifying distortion pedal of basically all the shit that we already know. What else is kind of urgent is what we can do about it, and where we can turn to start that process. If, as we suspect, I think, the assumptions which underpin these rather grubby sciences are in fact just a more refined version of the same problematic, that there's a deep commitment, and almost certainly a moral commitment, a affective commitment towards the kind of insights that are generated mathematically, their purity, their symmetry, their abstraction. If this is somewhere at the core of the sort of knowledge frameworks that we've all absorbed without even knowing it, because you don't have to do a PhD in particle physics to have absorbed this. It becomes through in everyday life. If we're all absorbing this at some level, and we believe it's producing a world that is undesirable or less than we should be living in, where do we turn for ways of understanding that are different? And for me, as I say, a feminist critique of these things is the unlocking. It looks at those ways of knowing in a social sense in the work of Miranda Fricker, but in a sense of science and technology studies, as you were already saying, in the work of people like Donna Haraway or Sandra Harding. It's looking at these assertions of superior insight and debunking them and counterposing something utterly different, counterposing that sort of relationality and difference, which goes back to what we were talking about originally. It's saying, how do we unpick how do we unpick this stuff? How can we weave something completely different from a different, starting with a different material and a different materiality? So yes, I guess when I was thinking about those things, I was thinking that I was looking at data science people speaking to data science people, like you're actuarial people talking to actuarial people, and that is a good starting point, because there the assumptions are not coated in the need for sort of ethical posturing or pretense at taking into account ordinary people's concerns. They're just expressed in the same way that the Snowden slides were so interesting, because they were really just, that was one intelligence agency talking to another. There was no attempt to coat it. So, we're going into those spaces, immersing ourselves in it, or I work it on an everyday basis, immersed in the language of computer scientists talking to computer scientists, but hearing it with a different, we're hearing the other, the other resonances, the other frequencies that speaks to, and wanting to put in something completely different.
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought us exactly where I wanted to start ending us, which is that, really, as a section in your introduction of the book puts it, from machine learning to mutual aid, and it really is, I think, that at the heart of all this is a feminist care ethic, and its importance, its centrality for not only critiquing but reorganizing, redirecting, restructuring, revolutionizing, and even in terms of just turning over these kinds of systems where a care ethic is largely devoid. This is one thing, and we can see this all over the place. It's in data science where there is no care ethic, there is no morality, right? Because it's just it's data in relation to other data, and so it's fundamentally inhuman by design. Computer says no, computer does not care, or it's in the things like what we started the episode talking about, and we spent all of the last premium one talking about, around like effective altruism and long-termism has kind of, made a virtue out of this kind of cold, calculative, moral decision making, which is by design devoid of any care ethic whatsoever. In fact, they see that as a weakness of other moral systems, that you would have something like care for other human beings rather than a calculus of utilitons or whatever it may be. And the same kinds of arguments have happened in the insurance industry, of course, where there is no care ethic, right? Like, since at least I've seen in the, since the 50s, actuaries writing in journals like, the Actuarial Society of American Proceedings, and stuff, so actuaries speaking to actuaries, which gets at exactly what you're just talking about, deride the kind of welfarist tendencies in seeing insurance as something, as a kind of social enterprise, a cooperative enterprise about, sharing sharing losses across the community, creating bonds of solidarity and care within communities. They deride that. They say, no, insurance is a system of risk transfer and reduction. That's all it is. And so, again, is that kind of by design devoid of a care ethic. And I think we have to take it seriously when we see it every single turn, all of these industries and all these ideologies spending so much time to rid themselves of any concerns about care, to smother in the cradle any critiques or alternatives that might take care seriously. And I think it's because it's a threat, right? It's an actual threat to their both their means and their ends, and therefore we have to take it seriously as a threat, and we have to wield it as it is, as this kind of effective alternative, effective critique, effective way of restructuring or revolutionizing. And so I'll give you the last word on this, and could you just talk to us a little bit about the last kind of couple chapters of your book, where you do expound more on this kind of positive ethic for data, AI, machine learning based on a kind of feminist care approach?
Yeah, I'll certainly give it a go. But I wanted to pick up on just very briefly on a couple of the points that you made, because I was thinking also about some of the other work that you've done, like around smart cities and so forth, and this constant, the particular narratives and even terminology that comes up so much in that. And again, I hear it in the episodes you guys do on anything to do with fintech or blockchain. The same morally valued terminology of efficiency, speed, and scale, these kind of ideas, which seem so kind of uncontentious. They may seem to us sort of unappealing on a daily level, or very appealing depending on what our allegiance is. But we don't read them perhaps in the way that we should do, which is that what they really express are a very muscular and sort of misogynist masculinity and control mentality that really ignores the realities of the work of care that underpins everything. The work of care, which is mainly done, by women, is mainly done by minoritized members of society. That work is none of those things. That work is awkward and sort of time consuming, and it is not frictionless. It is not fast. It doesn't work at scale. It works locally. It is, and it requires patience. It requires compassion. This is what underpins, because, and this is maybe trying to get more to the point of answering your question, that the alternative ontology, so it's the alternative epistemology I would pose against those which are weaponized by systems like AI, is exactly that of interdependence, exactly one where we start with relationality rather than a world of objects. We're starting by recognizing our interdependence, as an epistemological starting point, and as a lived reality. There's none of this would happen. I would not be able to do the work I do. We would not be able to sit in these studios talking with these technologies if it wasn't for this relational fact that the world is underpinned by acts of care from the very moment of giving birth to any of us. So these things are I believe, actually a more profound reality than any of the Neoplatonic claims to knowledge. And, like, really fortunately for us, these things come with, where a lot of work has already been done to articulate what is a feminist approach, for example, to social questions, or what is a feminist approach to the idea of science, for example. And I try to take those things and combine, or sort of work through them in understanding what this might mean as actual sort of tactics. I really am interested in things changing. And at the moment, obviously they are changing, but in a fairly horrendous and threatening direction. And I think it's pretty much of a duty for all of us to try to articulate different understandings and visions of what we might do about it. So in the last part of the book, try to articulate a starting point like this. I try to express what form that might take. So I'm looking at, generalized activities of mutual aid and solidarity, but how they might emerge, which they have done already in response to some of the threats of AI in things like workers' councils, and to try and generalize that to the idea of people's councils. So these are, if my understanding is that AI is an apparatus, by which I mean it's those technical bits we're talking about, those institutional bits we've talked about, and all the human activities that occur around it are, in some sense, a mutually articulated engine of some kind, and the one of the tasks that faces is constructing a different engine, constructing a different apparatus, because these apparatuses are themselves productive of reality. So where can we start? Well, with an epistemology of relationality. How do we approach doing something? We get together. We get together in horizontal and mutually consensual modes of organizing to challenge what's already going on. That's where the People's Council things come in, and also to try to understand, the particularly the most toxic aspects of the current system, which are, leading to everyday cruelties and also leading to ecological collapse. The ongoing modes of enclosure, the ongoing modes of exclusion, the ongoing forms of elimination and necropolitics, which is something that is kind of that terminology of expressing a system that comes to a point where it's very much in the business of simply deciding who's going to live and who's going to die, who's going to be allowed to die, or perhaps who's going to be actively encouraged to die. Countering that with a system, yes, it's based on care, that articulates mutual aid and solidarity, but also has a concept of the commons. And this is maybe, the sort of the ghost of Luddism which haunts this conversation, that the Luddites themselves, had one of their threatening letters, because the only literature we have from the Luddites is the ones that the British Home Office retained in their archives, of reports of informers and spies, but also the threatening letters that the Luddites themselves did pen to various factory owners. And, one of them has the timeless phrase of, put down all machinery hurtful to the commonality. And I think the inversion of the state of exception, the counterpoint to these aggressive and violent and algorithmically mediated ways of organizing society, and is not inverting exclusion with inclusion, because that's really just part of the same conceptual framework. It's the other to that, and the other for me is the common. So I spend some time at the end there trying to picture a way forward, which has built into it the kind of conviviality, to pick up on Ivan Illich's phrase, the kind of conviviality of a potential future that will involve technology, will involve technology and technical arrangements, techno-social arrangements, but is explicit about its political commitments, to a fairer world for everyone, and explicit about its solidarities.
Well, on that then, I highly recommend everybody grab a copy of Resisting AI. If you listen to TMK, you will see a lot of resonances with the kinds of things we talk about on TMK, the approaches we take on TMK, with Dan's own analysis and arguments and recommendations in Resisting AI. There's we're all working in the same crowd, absolutely, and I love to see it. I love to see the continual growth and rehabilitation and revitalization of a properly Luddite approach to understanding these technologies, as mechanically, but also in terms of where we need to be taking them critically. So grab a copy of Resisting AI for more of all what we've been talking about this episode. But Jeremy, I'm gonna throw it over to you before we head out.
Well, yeah, I just had a couple little lighthearted things, I guess, in the episode off of, because a lot of the topics that you covered in this book are pretty, they're pretty damning and pretty heavy. And I get it. There's a place for it, but I kind of have a question for you, Dan. How do you feel about AI being used in art, and how copyrights about those things? So, perfect example is a lot of people now using the DALL-E AI tool where they're creating art, or there's been people discussing, I don't know, how to go forward with copyrights on AI made music, shit like that. What do you feel about that? Personally, as someone who creates art and music, I don't need quote unquote AI taking my job. That being said, there are a couple of times where I've seen things that I'm like, okay, that's pretty damn funny. Some of the DALL-E, and then most recently I had someone point out to me that there was a bot that was fed nothing but folk punk lyrics for hours on end, and then wrote a folk punk song that is basically every folk punk song ever written. Is just talking about how they hate their life, they want to get drunk, and they really hate the cops.
Yeah.
So how do you personally feel about art's place in AI? And do you think that it's something that can be discussed as away from the topics of your book, or do you feel that is something that can be also encompassed in the conversation in your book?
Oh yeah, I thought you were going to put in something light at the end there. I'm going to put a position on art and creativity. I saw something today, I think it was actually very similar, which was somebody asked GPT-3 to write a poem in the style of Lord Byron about the internet being invented in 1803 or something like that, and it was great. I'm getting a lot out of that. I'm getting a lot out of the DALL-E stuff, and if there is in some ways a sort of legit application of AI, I would say it's a bit like it's a mixtape technology, and that's okay. I think actually, the questions about intellectual property or whatever, I'm not like a big fan of intellectual property per se, but I would say that the idea that actually it's just, it's a great technology, like in the much more serious stuff we were talking about, it's good at busting constraints, right? So you could say that this stuff is sort of running into everyone's portfolio, grabbing stuff, and then sort of, remixing it for everyone else's amusements. And that's okay. And people are adding to that with their own genuine creativity. I mean, if you look at my understanding of DALL-E, and I've fiddled with it a little bit, is to get anything really good out of it, you actually have to put a lot of time into experimenting with your prompts. And that in itself is clearly an area of actual creativity. Being able to sort of mess with this thing and get it to come up with something good in itself is a particular form of, contemporary creativity. And so I suppose my interest in it would be, something like the sort of situationist idea. Can you use this? Can you use the tools of the system to detour themselves, as they would say, to turn back on themselves, to subvert themselves? If something that we can do with the creative technologies of AI is part of constructing a counterculture of critique of AI itself, something that exposes its own, somewhat parasitic nature, but uses it to poke fun at the system and just enjoy that really valuable moment, which I totally get, of understanding our own ironic moment where we can all see what's going on, and right now we've got very little we can actually do about it, and that first sharing of that is like really valuable. But I'd like to say, that what does it mean if we take that onto the streets? That's what I'm really interested in. Where's that counterculture, gonna make an impact?
Part of me feels that it, like something like DALL-E or like the AI-driven music creation platforms that are available to use, is I feel like it's a way of like soft introduction into people with people that may not be versed in stuff like machine learning or AI. It might be like a soft intro into them, like look, it's not so bad. It's it's taking your suggestions and making art, or taking suggestions and making music. I don't know what they're doing with that information in the long run, though.
Yeah, and I think that's what the situationists were sort of, they got caught in that lobster pot themselves. I think they were saying that they were on the one hand saying that the spectacle, the system that we're surrounded in, is complete. That every critique gets reabsorbed into the system and becomes an extension of that system. And I think there's something like that happening with AI. It seems like maybe we could use this tool as a way of getting an insight that empowers us in some ways into the problems of AI, or at least brings an element of doubt. Like, if the art can do some crazy thing like that, well, I really hope it's not, they're not using some similar system to check my cancer scans or something like that. That's a really valid question to ask, and it's doing something very similar, and going to have similar sort of weirdo failure modes, which are very amusing when it's art and not so amusing when it's your medical tests. So maybe there's a way of sort of detouring and subverting this stuff. But that situationist analysis had its own limits. I'm just as when Jathan was talking about the book, and I was thinking about the Luddite, the Luddite standpoint, which I would align myself with. I was thinking I maybe should have called the book "Refusing AI," and I think this is maybe where I'm at. Really, it's like I do find this stuff fun, some of it funny, and I like it, and it's amusing. But I do feel that overall, I don't know if this is your sense of it as well, Jeremy, but I think overall, if you look at the sort of wider effects it has, it's kind of softening things, it's luring people in, it's making them feel like it's fun. And actually, we should just throw the off switch on this stuff altogether and start somewhere else.
I agree with you. Can you imagine a world where you get denied your insurance money by the same AI that also created your favorite piece of art and favorite music?
It's happening.
Yeah, I mean that's not a world that's unrecognizable from the one we live in. I do enjoy that like TMK has so corrupted Jeremy now that this is his idea of something light and fun for the end of the episode. Well, on that note, I'm gonna call an end to this episode. Dan has been so gracious to stay up very late for us to record. So thank you, Dan. This was a lot of fun. I'll throw a link to your Twitter, the book, and the article in the episode description. Is there anything else that you want to direct people to?
Yeah, well, no, not really. But I mean, those will do great, because what I'm really interested in is exploring these ideas with other people. You know, I'm throwing something out there as to start a conversation, be part of a process. Like you say, we're all part of that process at the moment. You know, and I'm really interested to hear from other people what they got to say.
Absolutely. All right. Well, and thank you, dear listeners, for your support. We always appreciate it. And you can find us for more on at patreon.com/thismachinekills, where we put out a premium episode every single week with these kinds of discussions, topics, and guests as we do on the free one. So find us over there. And until next time, later.